Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew, and welcome back to Frames of Space. Today's episode is very interesting because it features a guest who knows quite a bit about progressive politics and progressive culture. His primary focus and one of his primary types of commentary is on the topic of housing. And we do talk about his housing commentary quite a bit, especially at the beginning. However, our talk on housing also serves as a broader window into a much larger discussion about the different factions of the left and what that says about Democratic Party politics right now. My guest's name is Darrell Owens, and what I find so fascinating about his commentary is his willingness to acknowledge the hard truths that progressives have traditionally failed to acknowledge, while still forcefully rejecting right-wing sentiment. A good example of this is that of homelessness. Darrell Owens lives in the solidly blue area that is the San Francisco Bay, and he's very frank about how bad homelessness is there and how the high levels of homelessness may be a direct byproduct of democratic governance. But as fascinated as I am by his coverage of issues like homelessness, one of the more interesting takes that he's had recently is that of what Democrats could do in light of their 2024 election loss. A good example of this is the rise of right-wing media influencers, like how in the past decade or so, there are plenty of right-wing commentators, people like Ben Shapiro, who have taken advantage of places like YouTube to gain a much larger following and spread right-wing ideas. Should liberals go on their platforms and try to debate them? Or would it be better to ignore them or try to prevent them from having a platform? These are all interesting questions that we discuss in this episode. Hope you enjoy. Darrell Owens, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So I guess my first question would be, who do you see yourselves as right now? Because in the past, I would have seen you as a housing policy analyst, but you sort of branched out a little bit. So, what would you say the focus of your political commentary is nowadays?
Whatever I want to talk about. I don't know. Usually it's housing policy. Sometimes it's culture. Sometimes it's general electoral politics. But I tend to talk about a wide variety of topics. I mostly keep my commentary about either high-level culture war stuff, and if not that, mostly local Bay Area politics.
Yeah. So, want to talk a little bit about housing policy?
Let's do it.
Yeah. So there's one quote that you said in one of your recent articles that I thought was kind of interesting, so I'm going to quote it now. Quote, "Liberals who pride themselves on being progressive build woefully inadequate levels of housing, while red states, for all their many issues, allow developers to lap coastal blue states in home construction. Since 2000, Texas and Florida have been building double, even triple the homes California and New York have, and that trend has continued into the 2020s. So I guess that got me thinking, do you think NIMBYism and housing shortages in general are currently a bigger deal in blue areas than red areas?"
Oh, absolutely. It's kind of hard to pin down area though, because it depends on the geographic level you're talking about. So I would say that so metropolitan areas, like Democratic voting metropolitan areas, I believe account for about 70% of our gross domestic product. They are our most economically efficient places to live. And they are often the places that are the highest housing burdened or have very low vacancy rates. Obviously not always the case. There's a lot of metropolitan areas that are lower income, such as, say, Detroit or some places in the South. But especially in coastal areas, they do disproportionately vote Democrat and disproportionately have housing shortages. Whether that is a product of them voting Democrat or not, it's kind of debatable, because I would say that in many conservative jurisdictions in the Bay Area, we deal with the same problems. So it may not necessarily be a function of them voting Democrat, but I do think it speaks more to their hypocrisy, because I mean, conservatives in America for a long time have kind of lived in more or less segregated communities. So it's not that much of a surprise, but when liberals do it, it kind of says something, right?
How much headway do you think has been made when it comes to the housing crisis in blue areas specifically? Do you think like a lot has been done, or do you think it's woefully inadequate?
I would say that California has culturally become pro-housing, right? The state legislator is saying we should build more housing, and that's good. And it's no longer the polarizing, stigmatizing issue it once was. But the legislation being proposed so far, I don't personally think reflects the cultural shift that has happened. We're still nibbling around the edges in terms of the housing shortage, when we're not really nailing down the big things. The big things are huge impact fees making housing construction infeasible. The big thing is per unit construction costs over $1 million. That's statewide now. That used to just be in some places it's statewide. The big thing now is the fact that you cannot get a permit in a couple months. It basically takes in many places up to 2 years. These are the big issues that I don't see the level of urgency being addressed. And that's what makes me feel like it's not as good as I would like it to be. There are jurisdictions that are Democrat voting that are doing better than us. So I would say Colorado is doing a much better job on housing policy than, say, California is. And I think that's one of the reasons why they actually didn't shift as far right in the recent 2024 election. But yeah, I mean, California, New York is the big enchilada. Seattle and, Washington State, Portland and Oregon, they are all not doing great on housing policy. I don't know. I would say California kind of jumped into this housing shortage issue first. Recently, New York passed the City of Yes policy, which will allow about 80,000 housing units, still woefully low, but that's something. It shows a cultural shift. New York is about where California was maybe 3-4 years ago, culturally speaking, but we still haven't seen laws that really hit at the meat of the housing shortage. We're seeing a lot of nibbling around the edges, and we're seeing a lot of incentive-based policy, and I'm becoming less convinced that incentive-based policies work.
Yeah. So I think thinking about some of your previous answers, I get the feeling that I know how you're going to answer this question, but I want to ask you this just to get you to flesh out your opinion more thoroughly. What would you say to someone who might argue that there has been a reticence on the part of left-wing communities to discuss some of the very real problems with blue areas like homelessness, out of a fear that they might cede ground over to conservatives on this issue?
It's actually really interesting. I'm right now writing a Substack about my auntie who was homeless in my town. I guess I'll give you a little preview. I have an auntie who, for a long time, I used to ride the bus, and I still ride the bus in Berkeley, but I used to ride the bus, and there was a Black homeless woman on it. I didn't really know she was homeless. I kind of maybe assumed she was, but she was always on my bus line, and she would always smile and say hi to me, and I didn't know why. I figured that maybe she knew my parents or something, and whatever. It wasn't until a few years ago I found out that that woman was my auntie, and that she's homeless, and she's one of the many homeless people in Berkeley, approximately 1,500 homeless people. And, my father told me the story about why she was eventually kicked out of my grandfather's house for her poor behavior and how she ended up on the streets. And I've just been thinking a lot about as we're in this big conversation about homeless people, the Tenderloin, Skid Row, people sleeping in their cars. And I'm just looking at my auntie and thinking man, my life could have been pretty radically different, had I just been born a little differently. Even in the same family circles, you have such radically different outcomes in life. And that's something that I've just been kind of struggling with. And I think a lot of people are struggling with it as homelessness gets worse in a lot of coastal areas. And people obviously don't like seeing encampments. I don't like seeing encampments. There's a problem with people who are severely mentally ill, who need to be taken care of. And there is a tension between, civil rights people who think that there should be no regulations on them versus people who think that they should be put under the control of some family member or authority figure. I think that there is a reluctance I think the reluctance is dwindling. I think that what happens is that if you're not allowed to, I'm just going to come out and like say it. Yeah, people don't like encampments. People don't like, feces on the ground. People feel like that the housing crisis for homeless people is like impossible to solve. And when you look at the construction cost per subsidized housing unit, it certainly feels that way. They feel like they can't say how they feel about these issues because there's a group of left-wing activists who will accuse them of being far right. And I do think that at least locally in California, we've seen already the early stages of the homeless backlash, I think. But yeah, I definitely think that there are some liberals who are like, I don't agree that all homeless people should be kicked out of our town, but I don't necessarily think that just because you pitch a tent somewhere means you should be completely immune from all like right-of-way laws. And they feel maybe frightened to say that because someone on Twitter will accuse them of being like far right.
Yeah, or like they're afraid that like this issue is sufficiently racialized such that they're not allowed to say their like opinions.
Do you mean radicalized or what do you mean by racialized?
Like there's like that someone who accuses them of being far right would like accuse them of being racist because of like disparities in like economic performance between races and how that correlates with homelessness.
So like the fact that most homeless people are black people would be like you're being anti-black by being anti-homeless?
Yeah, something like that.
I mean, sure. I've not seen that as much as I've seen just people kind of charging that you're generally anti-poor. But also, like, I don't know. Anyone can say anything. It's kind of, I don't put too much stock into people's being frightened by this. The elected representatives increasingly of California are less tolerant to encampments. And so even if people may feel uncomfortable saying these things, the voters aren't at the ballot box, which unfortunately sucks because there were ways to radically reduce homelessness in blue areas. We saw Housing First working in Houston pretty well. And we saw that there was ways to stop the encampment problems in California, the way New York does a lot of shelter policy. I mean, you're out on the East Coast. I know you have homeless problems or whatever, but like they're nothing like California's. And if, I took a train from Baltimore to New York City, and I was kind of astounded that along the train ride, like I didn't see encampments anywhere. You ride a train in California, you're going to see encampments at like every train station. And that's because the East Coast has better shelter policies than we do. So now everything is so expensive. Construction costs are so expensive. You're going to be spending like well over $1 million just to put someone in housing. And that, that makes people feel like this is just not a scalable solution. And so people are going to turn to more punitive politics.
Yeah, that does make me raise a question where I'm not that familiar with this. So enlighten me based on your own personal experience. Do you know of any like people in the San Fran Bay Area where you might even like describe them as like closet conservatives that agree with like right-wing critiques of homelessness in blue cities?
Oh, sure. Yeah, a lot of them.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot more common than people think. Now, how it necessarily reflects on voting habits, I can't say for sure. First of all, in most of the Bay Area, most suburban jurisdictions don't like homelessness and don't really tolerate encampments. So they're mostly concentrated in the city areas. So San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley. If they are homeless in the suburbs, they have to be a lot more discreet about it. But you're not going to see like sprawling encampments and heaps of trash like you do in Oakland and say like suburban Fremont, where I used to live. But yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of closet conservatives who feel like I don't know, it's the liberal who's been mugged thing, right? Like eventually, if you live in like the Tenderloin. I'll be honest. I know a lot of people in the Tenderloin. Most of them Hispanic, but some of them white. I don't know any black people live there who are basically like, this homeless situation is completely out of control. The fact that people are allowed to do this while I spend all this money on city fees, city parking, muni, etc. That we just have to tolerate that, like, people just shoot up drugs in the BART station, and that someone on Twitter is going to call me anti-poor if I'm not comfortable with it. Yeah, there's a lot of people who are becoming potentially radicalized into becoming conservatives, which, by the way, I actually think reflects poorly on them. I think that if you let your opposition or people who criticize you dictate your politics, you're just as much of a slave in one direction as you are the other. I have problems potentially with the way a lot of encampments are managed. I do think encampments should follow rules just like anybody else. But at the same time, like, I'm not going to become some like rabid far-right conservative, or even really a conservative, formerly being like a liberal, left liberal, just because the homeless situation is bad. Like, I try to have a holistic worldview, and I try to apply it like with a concrete set of principles, rather than just be a reactionary about whoever is critiquing me at said given time.
I think go ahead.
I've been attacked by like left-wing progressives before, not really over homelessness policy. They attacked me over supporting market rate housing development, but like, I don't let them dictate my politics. That's not how that works.
I think that definitely applies to people like us that like follow politics and are just like terminally online. But I guess where I do want to push you is that, like, maybe regardless of like whether it's on them, maybe we should be at least a little bit sympathetic to people for whom their consumption of politics isn't as all-consuming as it is for us. Because for people who consume politics in a way that is as all-consuming as us, we can always find like some way to acknowledge like criticisms of our side while not letting it dictate the way that like our like identity politics leans. But like, most people don't have the disposition to like focus on politics in like the very terminally online and like unique political positions that we do. So maybe like, regardless of whether it's on them, we should at least be sympathetic, because they're like the way that we view politics is probably very alien to them anyway.
Oh, no, I totally agree on that. I think most normal people that I talk to, people who are not chronically on Twitter, people who are not involved in activist organizations, are pretty fed up about the homeless problem in the Bay Area. And I mean, I had friends, casually tell me, like my former coworker at Walgreens, we used to work at a really rough Walgreens in a pretty rough part of town. And we used to have to deal with like homeless people or mentally ill people coming in and like sometimes causing problems. Now, recently I had met up with him like after 10 years, and he told me, he said, the homeless problem on like our BART system is like so out of control. Like, I don't even feel comfortable riding it anymore. I have a coworker of mine who is a young Asian woman who has endured harassment by a mentally ill person on public transit and now drives, even though they live in a transit-oriented development project. Some of my relatives recently, this Thanksgiving, were complaining about their favorite park being taken over by people with tents, right? So, like, I may disagree with them. Actually, I'm sure I do disagree with them on, say, the solutions to homelessness. I don't necessarily disagree on the problem. Like, it's actually not good that our parks are full of tents, right? Like, it's not good that there's tons of needles all over, skid rows. These aren't good things. I disagree on the solutions, perhaps. I disagree on how punitive we should be about it. But I completely think that people having these feelings are valid. Like, I also recognize that I'm wealthy enough to live in a neighborhood that doesn't have many of these social vices, and that a lot of the people that I know who complain about them aren't. So that's, I am sympathetic for sure.
What would you say are like what would you say are the political views of the people you meet regularly? Would you say they tend to be more left-leaning than you, more right-leaning than you? Like what would you say?
Oh, well, then me? It depends. Like, in real life, when I'm talking to people, just like, if I were to talk about people in my neighborhood, I live in a wealthy neighborhood in Berkeley, I would say I'm pretty far to the left of many of my neighbors. If I were talking to people online, I would say that they're more or less in line with my left liberal ideology. if I go to like some like gentrifying parts of town which has all the nice clubs and night bars, which I do a lot, I tend to find a wide array of people, many of whom are far left, young college educated people, nonprofit workers. If I talk to people over 30, over 40, over 50, who are not like, who are like in the rest of the Bay Area, for example, they tend to be to my right. They tend to be maybe economically liberal, but socially conservative. And when I say socially conservative, I usually mean doesn't like crime and doesn't like homelessness. Like that's kind of their big.
Do you think
like, but that like they support police and they support being more punitive towards criminals.
Okay. Do you like, would you say that you meet a lot of like shy conservatives in your like social circles in real life?
I'm actually doing an article about a white guy I knew that turned out to be kind of one of these shy Republican conservatives. Personally, I want to say no, I just don't. I don't live in that kind of environment. Maybe they don't feel comfortable coming out and talking about that. I don't know, but I don't personally meet a lot of shy conservatives. I do know studies show that like liberals tend to have less non-liberal friends than conservatives tend to have non-conservative friends. So that's probably just a self-selection thing. I mean, my values and my principles, if I had like a Trump supporting friend, I probably wouldn't be very nice with them. So like, it kind of makes sense that they sort of self-select out.
Yeah. So would you consider homelessness to be one of the main causes for why Democrats lost the 2024 election?
I honestly am not sure. I would have told you yes, maybe yesterday, but this morning I read a New York Times article that did this kind of interesting statistical analysis on regions that swung right. And what they generally found is that regions with heavy amounts of Hispanics and non-college educated minorities swung right. And that it didn't really correlate that hard with areas most ravaged by homelessness or areas that are most democratic leaning per se. It's just that like urban non-college minorities swung right. And that could be because of the fact that turnout was down among Democrats. It could also be because there was mass dissatisfaction. It's probably a mixture of the two, but I haven't seen too much evidence that it correlates with federal level politics. It is definitely in the lexicon, though, that blue cities struggle with high housing costs and homelessness. That is part of like a failure of blue city democracy, as it should be. It is a failure. It frustrates me that Republican-run cities and suburbs and rural areas do not get anywhere as much scrutiny, but nevertheless, that is reality.
So then maybe if homelessness is not the cause, maybe inflation and or the economy was the main driver for why Democrats lost.
Maybe. That's the line. I don't even know if I believe that. I mean, the thing is, if you talk to most people who vote for Trump, and I actually do talk to some Trump supporters. So like my father has a farm out in like San Joaquin Valley, and I sometimes go out there and talk to people like that, Trump supporters. They tend to live out there. And like, I feel like if a reporter or somebody comes up to them and says, hey, why did you vote for Trump? They're going to be like, oh, inflation in the economy. But I feel like if you actually, because that's like the respectable answer. But if you
do you think it was actually wokeness? Do you think wokeness played a bigger role in why Democrats lost?
It's just hard to say. I think that there's a lot of people who are sympathetic to Trump because they don't like wokeness. I think that's absolutely true. I think that people feeling like they're getting mobbed on Twitter by a bunch of left-wingers is why, I think the backlash to the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests and the whole awakening thing.
Yeah, like the Matt Iglesias thesis of like the Great Awakening.
Yeah, but the timing is kind of weird. That's what I don't get. Like all that happened in 2020. We should
2020 and 2021.
Yeah, and even before then, like it had been leading up. Like before George Floyd's video went viral, like every other week on Twitter, it was, racist police abuse videos going viral.
Yeah, some like defund the police, like all of that.
I mean, I feel like defund started in 2020, but anti-police activity started like after Michael Brown, whenever that was, 2012, 2014. And then well into 26. I mean, I remember like in 2016, Hillary had to like back away from calling like black criminal offenders super predators because the cultural shift had already gone more anti-police in left-wing circles. And then when Trump was in office in the first term, the country was obsessed about finding racism everywhere. We had the Charlottesville riots. We had the Antifa riots here in Berkeley against Milo Yiannopoulos. The whole country was already pretty wokeifying. I mean, I think woke started in like 2011, and then it just started like on like a exponential curve, just started like going up, 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 up. And then it kind of blew up with the lockdown and the shelter in place. Now, if the 2024 election was a backlash to that, it's possible. I think it definitely contributed maybe perhaps to a lot of young men who are chronically online, but maybe not in political circles, skewing more towards Trump, maybe not necessarily towards Republicans. I think that's probably true. Particularly issues around feminism and sexual assault. I think that's true. Dating and whatnot. I mean, the algorithms are wild, but I don't want to say that 2024 was a product of that. I would say that the number one cause of Harris losing the 2024 election is that nobody knew who she was. That's probably what it was. I think that's the main issue. Second behind it, maybe inflation, wokeness, blue city, democratic governance, whatever. Although I don't know. The New York Times survey couldn't find much evidence. I'm about to get the precinct maps of the East Bay, Oakland area. I'm going to do a lot of analysis of like Asian enclaves, black enclaves with a lot of homelessness, wealthy ones. We're going to try to figure out if we can determine something here.
Yeah. Okay. I find this really interesting. So like you would say, number one, people don't know who Harris is. Number two is wokeness. And number three is inflation. Is that your ranking?
Yeah, I mean, maybe inflation number two, wokeness number three. I just feel like the wokeness stuff is built in by this point.
Well, no. So like I talked with Noah Smith. He gave an interesting theory, which is that there's a lag between when something happens and when people allow themselves to feel mad about it. Where like 2020 is when it was a new thing. So that's when it was like the country was like 51-49 or 52-48 in favor of it. And then like a few years later, that's when people like give themselves the permission structure to get mad at wokeness in a way that they felt like they couldn't when it first arose, if that makes sense.
That is possible.
Yeah.
It's also possible that the presidential election just was not a major referendum on wokeness in either situation.
Yeah.
I mean, Biden clearly thought that the wokeness backlash was a problem. That's why he was all like, I support the police in 2020. Yeah. Clyburn was on a call with Nancy Pelosi and all of them complaining that like black voters were turned off by defund the police after Biden had won. I feel like the backlash had already started and the wokeness thing probably just blew up. The pandemic made people go crazy. I don't know. I think the
pandemic made people on both the left and the right go crazy.
Sure. I agree with that.
Yeah.
All right, so there's one quote that you wrote in one of your articles that I'm going to quote right now. So, quote, "The liberal and leftist reluctance to debate or counter right-wing propaganda, driven by a misguided 2010s era progressive ethos of not validating the right, effectively conceded online media spaces like YouTube to right-wing content creators for perhaps a generation," end quote. So when you say that there's like a misguided 2010s era progressive ethos of not validating the right, what does it mean to like you're saying that like they refuse to go on right-wing platforms out of a desire to like not validate them?
Yeah, there was this whole like anti-debate culture in 2016, 2017. So like I was in Berkeley, California, which was the epicenter of the Milo Yiannopoulos anti-fascist riots. And it was this time where Milo went on campus and he would go on campus on purpose to make people mad and to rile people up because people were very sensitive about racism as Trump had just won. And it felt like it was a victory for the alt-right. And you had this sect of like left-wing thought on campus that was like, we cannot tolerate him speaking at the campus at all because, you know, he will spread his abhorrent views. The institutions will be validated and that the liberal opinion that his views should be debated and rebuked, or that he should be tolerated under free speech, essentially was tantamount to violence. So anti-fascist protesters, many of which were my friends, by the way, went out and protested Milo. And then because they can't control themselves, they started breaking windows and doing a bunch of dumb shit. And that culminated in Milo constantly coming back to UC campus and blowing himself up, making himself popular, getting all national news obsessed about this, as left-wing protesters would go around in black-clad outfits, and Milo would get all this attention and all this coverage. Fast forward to 2024, nobody knows who Milo Yiannopoulos is. And the truth is that those protests had helped him, when in reality, his ideas were stupid, his opinions were stupid. When liberal pundits on YouTube finally debated Milo, he turned out to be a big idiot, and being exposed as a moron hurt his brand. But when he was seen as this like left-wing this agitator of the left, that the left was too afraid to debate, that's where he got all his stardom from. And so my point is that like the substance of the right is actually pretty weak. Their arguments are weak, their ideas are weak, but because we have this mentality of like, just ignore them, don't debate them, or just protest them, don't debate them, don't counter them in any way.
Maybe it was driven by like an internal insecurity that they might be right.
I think that's absolutely true. Yeah, which they actually weren't right. You know, we have a lot. Like I noticed one of the things that's come out since 2020 is like a lot of liberal and left wing debaters and pundits online. We could have used these guys back in 2014 when this was all getting started, but you know, maybe 8 years isn't too late. That are like, these people are idiots, right? Like they go on Piers Morgan's show and they clown him. You know, the people like Ben Shapiro are afraid to have him on. Their substantive arguments suck, but they were given this era of invulnerability because of this like early ethos. We're like, we're not going to debate them. We're not going to like thoroughly debunk their arguments. We're not going to take them seriously. We're not going to validate the right by addressing the right or allowing them on college campuses or whatever. I say let them go on college campuses. Like they don't have any influence. All the people who go out there and watch them is the college Republicans or whatever. But when people were making all that havoc in Berkeley, they were just elevating Milo, right? They were making him seem like he was some smart guy. He was an idiot. And as soon as people started to ignore him, that's when they discovered that, oh, that's actually a lot more effective than pumping him up with this ego that protesting him is that he's some person of significance. Now, I'm not saying that they should be ignored. I do think that if, as I said earlier, not addressing the right did lead to the rise on YouTube of these terrible content creators. That's why BreadTube started. But in general, they need to be belittled. I think that's kind of the main point. They need to be belittled. And, you know, when Ben Shapiro made a name for himself by this, like, I'm facts over feelings BS, he should have been exposed as a fraud by being debated and debunked. And all it required liberals to do was to just do debate prep beforehand, was to study up on their issues and to defeat them. And then they would have proven to be right. But, you know, and the right is...
But maybe, like even if they're proven to be right, maybe if they're proven to be like 80% right and 20% wrong, maybe they're afraid of even being a little bit wrong.
Sure. I mean, there was some amount of like peer pressure among left-wing circles to not concede any arguments, right? So like if you criticize defund the police, for example, maybe if you argue with Ben Shapiro and you're a liberal and you're like, well, actually, yeah, I think defund the police is like a dumb idea. You know, maybe a group of humanities students would like protest you or crucify you over that. I don't know how serious this stuff was, but I do definitely know, like, at least online, there was a lot of these opinions.
And that's why the pandemic was so bad, is that when everything transferred online, the fact that these people were online meant that some people had to like actively lose their jobs instead of just having a dumb mob come after them because everything was online back then.
Yeah, I do think that the Twitter world was given disproportionate amounts of importance that it probably did not warrant. The mob mentality was pretty big in 2020, disguised as justice, but in practice was just a mob. You know, like take, for example, it seemed like every week in 2020, kids would like surface a video of some like white girl saying nigga in a song, which like I don't agree with them doing, but at the same time, like if rappers sell their music to mostly white people, like obviously white people are gonna say nigga in private. I hate it, but like that's what they do. They're not stupid. But like they would like surface these clips, and then they would try to ruin these girls' lives, and it's like it's a bunch of adults like going out there. This isn't justice. Like they're not learning anything, right? All you're doing is you're contributing to a mob, and a mob that turned out to not even be that politically powerful. Now we're going to 2024 where there's this whole, and maybe Noah Smith is right here, this like lagged backlash where like companies are like, actually, DEI is not good. Actually,
I agree that DEI is not good.
Right. Like, well, we can debate that. That'd be an interesting thing to debate.
Yeah.
Like all this stuff is not good. Like they're doing this like kind of rightward shift, and it turns out that like online mobs actually don't have that much power, right? Yeah. Like they had power, but maybe they don't. It kind of depends. And I do think that people thought that the Twitter outrage machine got too powerful. But part of the problem too is because all the elites are on Twitter. The journalists, the pundits.
Yeah, like Joe Biden stepped down on Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Even though average people are not on Twitter. Like, I'll tell you this, when I go to when I'm partying out with my friends and we talk to people and we like exchange social media contacts, the least common social media contact exchanged is Twitter. Like, I'll tell people, oh yeah, I have like a Twitter account. And they'll be like, oh, they'll pull up their Twitter and like their last tweets from like 2021 or something. Like, people don't really tweet much on Twitter because it's kind of a hard place to get traction if you're not popular. You're mostly tweeting into the void. Most people do Facebook or TikTok, or sorry, not Facebook. Most people do Instagram or TikTok or whatever. So the problem is the people on Twitter are like the New York Times writers, the White House staffers, the heads of colleges, leadership, the biggest, loudest activists. They're all on Twitter, but they are a minority of the population, a tiny sliver of the population.
Yeah.
And it led people to think that like ideas were bigger than they actually were, right? So like as I talked about in my article, the popularity of abolitionist police abolition, which is essentially like ideological anarchism, right? That's a valid theory that grew to popularity because of elite persuasion on Twitter. Prior to George Floyd, did not have that much traction in the real world. I mean, there were some stuff here and there, but it was still considered a pretty obscure ideology. And then 2020, it blows up because everyone's focused on Twitter, where these circles all like circulate their own stuff. And then we find out that it's actually a not very popular idea, especially among the communities that it would most affect, right? So, yeah, Twitter was always an elite persuasion circle.
Yeah. So how strongly do you believe the things that you say on Twitter?
Pretty strongly, to my detriment at times. But I mean, sometimes I'm just shitposting. I don't know.
Yeah, but like maybe that's an area where you're part of the problem.
Why? Because like I'm part of elite persuasion.
Yeah, you're part of the whole elite capture thing, maybe.
Oh yeah, but like I think that I've contributed to a lot of good. The growth of the YIMBY movement, right? The pro-housing movement, urbanism, pro-transit stuff. It's grown to a lot of generational prominence among young people, mainly because of Twitter. Like I hate to say it, as I point out, I think in my article, a lot of major reforms that we've made was the product of just posting on Twitter. I know people don't want to.
It's kind of sad, though.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it was
because like Twitter is also where people use the megaphones to like get people fired.
Sure, and honestly, some people deserve to get fired. Like it depends on the gravity of their situation. I think in 2020 it went too far. I don't think people deserve to get fired over saying one little thing or have an old mistake. I mean, it's a matter of degrees. And the problem with Twitter mobs is that it doesn't take that many people. You know, there's like how many people on the planet are there? 7 billion people? 7 billion people on the planet. And like, it takes like 100 people on Twitter who could be living anywhere on the planet to like get someone fired. I think that stuff is stupid. Again, I agree. The getting people fired stuff was stupid. I thought I received a bunch of backlash for, I remember the city bike thing.
Yeah, it's like a lot of what was going on in the left was like a circular firing squad in a way.
It was a circular firing squad and it was a mob. It was a digital, and obviously it didn't have that much sway in the real world, but the thing about Twitter is it's really good at making things look bigger than they actually are. We live in an unprecedented time where 7 billion people can all contact each other. And so 1,000 likes on Twitter seems like a big deal. Seems like your whole community is against you. In practice, half those mofos don't even live on the same continent as you. I mean, it just doesn't mean anything. You know?
Yeah, no, I think that's the problem. Like you can ship posts on Twitter and trick yourself into thinking that it doesn't mean anything until it turns out to have tangible consequences.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I don't disagree.
Yeah, all right.
I ship posts on Twitter and do something? Are you referencing something?
The part where you said anyone shitting on Biden for the pardon should further be ignored for any political commentary. Nobody gives a fuck about norms and decorum. Voters made that shit clear 3 weeks ago, you idiots. I think you went way too far with that.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry. I will not make any concessions on this. I don't give a fuck about the pardon. If you want to talk about Trump politics, we can. Like, Trump has pardoned his own family members for these crimes, and the disproportionate amount of media coverage he gets for his misbehavior means that by entertaining this stuff for Biden contributes to that kind of environment where liberals and Democrats are held to a comically high standard. Trump has proven by taking advantage. So, like, I know people are going to say, well,
but like, no, like, right now you're making a much more qualified and nuanced statement than the statement that you made on Twitter. Like, that's the problem.
Okay, sure. Sure, I agree. Although, I guess what I would say to that is you should probably look at the volume of my tweets where I more or less convey this point. But like a tweet by itself, sure, like in a vacuum, it seems like it's quite extreme. Just like opening a random book and going to a random page looks quite extreme, right? Like, unless you understand the general context of what I'm getting at, which, as I've been emphasizing since the election, even before the election, is the both sides bullshit doesn't work, and it is not what journalists and media is supposed to do. And when it does that, it equivocates and downplays the tremendous harm that Trump has caused to the country by pretending it is comparable to anything Biden has done. And as a result, everyone freaking out about the pardon, saying that like this is really bad because it sets some bad precedent. It doesn't set any new precedent. Trump pardoned criminals who rioted at the Capitol for him, commenced their sentences already, and pardoned his own family members who were accused and convicted of these crimes. Biden doing this because his son's being used as a witch hunt for gun and drug charges, which it is, like, it's bull. So for me,
yeah,
I'm gonna.
You're still making a subtly different claim than like the claims that you make on your tweets. Like that's the point that I'm trying to make.
And the subtly different one being that like anybody who complains about Biden's pardon should forever be ignored for political content.
Yeah, or like when you say like any Democratic pundit saying Trump will pardon the J6 rioters thanks to Biden's pardon of Hunter should be excommunicated from the Democratic Party. We cannot afford. We cannot afford to have people this fucking stupid weighing us down any longer. End quote.
That's true.
All right, I disagree. I disagree with you about that.
You really think that like Trump is going to pardon J6 rioters because Biden pardoned Hunter?
No, and that's once again, this is a different claim than the claim that you made on your tweet. There's a difference between
Sorry, sorry. Go ahead. Tell me the claim as you understand it.
All right, so the claim that you understand is that like is exactly what the tweet says. Any Democratic pundit from MSNBC, New York Times, or whatever saying Trump will pardon the J6 rioters thanks to Biden's pardon of Hunter should be excommunicated from the Democratic Party. Like, you're not saying I think that they're like blatantly wrong for reason A, B, and C. You're saying anyone who says this should just like automatically be excommunicated. And like you're saying we should throw them under the bus.
Yeah, they should be thrown under the bus.
Yeah, so then that's where I disagree with you. I'm not saying that like the J6 rioters are going to be pardoned because of like Hunter, like whatever the Hunter Biden stuff is. I'm saying that we should like
excommunicate them.
Huh? I'm saying we should not excommunicate them. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, first of all, I'm mostly talking shit. I mean, we can't functionally excommunicate anybody from a party.
Yeah, so you were shit
But what
posting.
yeah, I'm shit posting partially, but what I'm trying to communicate is there should be tremendous negative ire delivered at those people because they're playing into Trump's hands. And that's the part that kills me. And I don't know how to communicate that any clearer than being hyperbolic about how they should be magically excommunicated, even though we don't have the power to do anything like that. Realistically, I don't think that people who claim to represent liberal ideas or democratic viewpoints should be holding that mantle up when they are enabling right-wing ideas. And I know that they don't think they're doing that. I understand that, but they are.
How do you know that you're not like contributing to the circular firing squad when you make those arguments?
Well, I guess maybe so like this contributing to the circular firing squad, I guess what is important to me is outcomes. Like I'm a very outcome-oriented person. And so I think that the Trump people have been very good at creating their own right-wing circular firing squad where nothing short of total allegiance to Trump gets you like excommunicated from the Republican Party. And it has essentially rewarded them with the White House, the Senate, the House, and now the Supreme Court. So their circling firing squad seemed rather good. Our approach of so-called open-mindedness, where we judge ourselves on a higher curve than our opponents, has given us tremendous backlash and has depressed our turnout in this recent election. So I don't necessarily think that circular firing squads are inherently bad, I guess.
Do you think we should promote more circular firing squads within like the Democratic Party?
I think that we should promote circular firing squads that enable us to win elections.
Yes, and wokeness did not help us win elections.
I guess maybe. It's kind of hard to tell. I don't know. In general, I think that we shouldn't be the party of people who are extremely anal about people making off-color jokes or whatever. Like, yeah, that's fine. I think that should be true. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't even know what wokeness is. Like people being hardcore obsessed about like identity politics, accusing everybody of racism flagrantly. Sure, I think that was probably too much. I think that most people don't want to be appealed to on the basis of race. I think that that's true. But I also don't necessarily think that the Democratic Party embraced this. I mean, even as Noah Smith talks a lot about too, this is mostly just culture stuff that reflects on the Democratic Party, even though the Democratic Party themselves may not necessarily embrace it.
I think they came close to embracing it in 2019 and 2020, but I wonder if we're spending way too much time on this topic.
I mean, but they were rewarded with the White House at those times. So
well, no, they were rewarded with the White House, A, because the coronavirus response that Trump failed in, and B, because they nominated Biden, who was one of the least woke candidates. But anyway.
Well, okay. I mean, I'd like to debate that, but we can move on.
Yeah. All right. So there's one quote from one of your articles that I kind of want to know what the implications are. So I'm going to quote it right now. Quote, "The number one thing that can be done to fight this, like this being referring to like the right-wing media machine, this is to fight propaganda directly. Funding counter-propaganda for the Democrats will take time, especially since corporations are wary of populist left ideas." End quote. Yeah, so I'm very curious what the subtext of that is. Do you think that the left needs to like deliberately fund like partisan disinformation campaigns in order to appeal to uneducated voters?
No, because propaganda doesn't inherently have to be nefarious or lies, right? There's white propaganda, there's black propaganda, yellow journalism, etc. I think that the point is that you need to advertise and communicate your policies. I think that the veracity of our policies is correct. But I think that they need to be communicated. I think one of the big problems with Biden is that he was probably one of the worst communicators in United States presidential history. He passed a lot of monumental policy like the IRA, the CHIPS Act, etc., and he does not know how to communicate these policies at all. It was so weird. It's like he has complete control of the bully pulpit, and yet all of our policy is being dictated online by right-wing groups.
So
I don't understand.
You think that we don't need to fund disinformation, but we do need to fund propaganda. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, information, right? Like propaganda. Like, do you think propaganda is like a negative thing?
I think that like the reason why you're saying propaganda instead of like popularizing information is because you're like very deliberately trying to invoke a specific connotation, and I'm trying to figure out what that is, because like I want to know what these things mean in practice in order to like understand like what they would mean in practice.
There's a difference, but okay, so I guess the reason why I use the word propaganda is because the ultimate aim is to advance the political cause of a political party. I'm not just necessarily interested in ideological or idea exchange. That doesn't necessarily advance the cause of a political party. Like, for example, communist YouTubers online are very interesting, but I don't necessarily think that correlates with them voting Democrat, right? I'm saying that like liberal pundits should put forward policies that encourage people to vote for the Democratic Party and put forward information that convinces them to do so, just as the Trump machine already does so online.
All right. So do you know of anyone give me some like frames of reference so that I can use to like try to gauge what this would actually look like? Do you know of any like popular, like, I don't know, online streamers or like media influencers that are like a good frame of reference for what you want the Democratic Party to do?
Sure. I think Ben Shapiro does a really good job at creating content for Trump and the Republican Party. He spends all his time attacking the right. Something that Democrats are really bad at doing, by the way, is
Ben Shapiro spent all his time attacking the right?
Attacking the left.
Okay.
He spends all his time attacking the left. He generally holds his criticism of his own party pretty low, unless absolutely necessary. And he generally communicates to his viewers who their enemy is. In contrast, a lot of left-wing pundits and commentators mostly spend their time criticizing the left or other Democrats or liberals or center-left people.
Weren't you doing something similar when you were on Twitter saying that like people should be excommunicated for like believing this thing that I think is dumb?
Sure, but like I said earlier, it's like going into the middle of a book and reading a line. Like if you look at the totality of my timeline, I've been pretty relentlessly mean to Trump supporters. I don't think anybody coming over from my page thinks I hate the Democratic Party. They're probably, they can clearly see I'm frustrated that people are not supporting the party and that they are instead giving ammunition to the opponents of the party.
But wouldn't you expect some like center left anti-woke Democrat to like say something very similar to you about like how like, oh, I would expect that anyone who reads my commentary knows that I don't actually hate the Democratic Party. I just want them to do better in these areas, and like that like anyone who reads my commentary would know that like I see Trump as the enemy or something like that.
I agree.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, it depends though. But when people say that and their actual commentary doesn't reflect that, that's a whole nother thing, right? There's a lot of left-wing pundits, I think. Like, okay, I don't necessarily agree with Bill Maher, for example. I think that he's kind of an idiot at times. But like, I wouldn't, even though he shits on left-wingers and woke or whatever, I would have no illusion that his audience are overwhelmingly Democratic voters and that he supports the Democratic Party.
Okay.
Because I look at the totality of his work and not just like one clip where he's attacking The View or communists on Twitter.
But do you think maybe there's a tendency among people that lean progressive to like take the clips of maybe like center left anti-woke commentators and take clips from them out of context in the same way that they might take clips of you out of context?
Can you give me like an example? Like who in particular?
Do you remember that like that really dumb thing where like Matt Iglesias was attending a luncheon, and then there were these like climate activists that like threw a fit?
Oh no! Yeah,
yeah. Like Iglesias lies, the planet dies. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do remember.
Yeah, maybe they're doing something similar in terms of like taking his content out of context in order to like misrepresent it so that they can throw a hissy fit.
Yeah, lefties online who ideologically don't agree with liberals and then try to take things out of context suck. I actually think that there's a lot of pretty legit criticisms of Iglesias. I've, for example, don't really agree with him on a lot of transgender issues, for example. But I wouldn't. Their particular use of taking things out of context was pretty stupid. I think they were mad at him about fracking. I don't even remember.
Yeah, no, it was fracking. Like they thought that like his support of fracking was going to ruin the planet.
Oh, yeah. And of course, like left-wing activists spending way more of their time protesting liberal pundits rather than protesting the right is pretty agitating and
Yeah.
irritating.
Uh,
I don't agree with that. That's something that I don't like. That's my criticism of the left, by the way, is that they spend way more time shitting on liberals than they do like the actual fascists or accusing liberals of being the social fascists. That stuff is just so stupid and it doesn't yield them anything. They depress liberal turnout they depress left turnout for liberals and then they enable the right. It's like Weimar Germany all over again, right?
yeah. But like maybe
All beating each other up in the streets while the Nazis rise. It's very frustrating.
I think that yeah, but like what would you say to someone who might respond to that by saying that we need to collectively find a way to escape like the circular firing squads that we're creating for each other?
I agree with being more tolerant of ideas I don't generally agree with on the left. I agree with that. There are people who have positions on single-payer healthcare or homelessness or crime or whatever who are to my right on those issues. But I wouldn't say that they're not Democrats or they're not liberals.
Yeah.
I don't pretend that they're fascist and I don't pretend that they're far right because they disagree on one issue. That's something that's really annoying to me too, especially
Maybe you should just say like I agree with you. Maybe you should say that a little bit more often.
I feel like I do. I don't know. I mean, like the article you read, for example, like isn't the general point that like we were captured by a small group of like young people who just had extreme left-wing antisocial ideas online and that in general most people weren't like that and we should be more tolerant of people who didn't fit in that space?
I think that you do it well, but I think you should do it like just like a tad bit more, if that makes sense. Just like a pinch.
I'm happy to do it.
Yeah.
But what I will not tolerate is people enabling the opposition party by holding us to false equivalence standards. If you want to do that in-house, like you want to do that in like the little like DNC private meeting, I don't care. If you want to critique Biden's pardon at a private conversation, I don't care. But when you put this content on Twitter, that is a social sphere. That is where we all have cross-reference to every ideology. And so you are giving the other side free ammunition by making these public denunciations of Biden's pardon, knowing full well that this is helping Trump to give him even more cover for when he was inevitably going to pardon the J6 rioters.
Do you think that so like the whole thing about how like you're saying that Democrats should not have like condemned like any like Democrats in general should not publicly condemn any of the Hunter Biden stuff, right?
Yes.
Do you think
not publicly? Do it privately? I don't care.
Do you think Democrats should not have like condemned like any of the assassination attempts that happened on Trump that happened earlier this year?
Ooh, that's a interesting one. No, I mean assassination, killing people is always going to look bad, and they should condemn it. But actually, you know what? Real talk. None of those shooters were Democrats. Both of whom were Republicans, registered Republican conservatives who shot Trump with gun laws Trump enabled. Why are Democrats apologizing for that at all? That's another example of us getting taking the blame for things we didn't do and false equivalency stuff. The right pretended that those shooters were left-wing lunatics. They weren't. They were right-wing lunatics. Why am I apologizing for it? I don't support the gun laws that allowed those shooters to get those guns, and I don't support the ideology that those shooters subscribe to. They're not the left. They're not left of center. They were right.
Yeah. So I'm not convinced of this, but I did hear that the first shooter did donate some money to the DNC at one point.
$15 to Act Blue after the election happened. The only reason why he would do that's probably because he lost a bet or something. He donated. I have it on Twitter, but like if you look at the litany of his political activity online, he was more right than left. I think with the first shooter, I think he was just like a school shooter type. He was just a crazy guy who wanted to shoot a politician, and he tried to initially target a Democratic one.
So like he is the equivalent of Lee Harvey Oswald, basically.
Sure, yeah, I don't think he was very political at all. But if you are going to ascribe a politics to him, it would be, since he was a registered Republican, it would be right. Moreover, he has a gun because of gun laws Republicans support. Why are Democrats apologizing?
Okay, but like so like we can talk about the merits, but like Like from a political standpoint, do you think Democratic politicians should have publicly condemned the assassination attempts on Donald Trump?
Yeah, condemned? Sure. Yes, condemned.
Yeah.
Apologize for and pretend that they are in any way contributing to the assassinations? No. But yeah, obviously, all political violence should be condemned. That is yet another example of how the right holds us to a higher standard that they themselves never do. I mean, remember how hard it was to get Trump to condemn the Proud Boys after Charlottesville?
Oh yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
He takes no hit for that, right? After they have to, hey, please condemn the white nationalist neo-Nazis. And then after like a bunch of begging, he does the whole both sides yes. Oh, well, there was good people on both sides. It's like, and then does he take any hit for that? No. Again, we hold ourselves to higher standards, and what does it get us? Nothing. But again, I would never support political assassinations or shootings or any kind of political violence. I'm against political violence. As I told you earlier, when we had the Milo riots in Berkeley, like I didn't support that. I didn't think that was good.
So you're not one of those leftists that like secretly wishes that Donald Trump was assassinated.
No, of course not. And even if I was, I wouldn't say it because that's why it's secret, right? But like, no, I wouldn't do it. I don't think so. I'd rather have defeated him than to shoot him.
Yeah.
I don't even think that those guns should be in circulation. I'm anti-gun. I wish all guns were confiscated and destroyed. Donald Trump is the guy who supports those high-powered rifles that he got shot with. Whose fault's that?
Final question. Let's say that tomorrow you suddenly got like a very high-ranking position within the DNC where you were able to make a lot of like top brass moves about what like messaging the party should do and stuff like that. What would you do?
I kind of agree that the overemphasis on identity politics is proving less and less useful. The Republican Party engages in identity politics too. They have since the days of the Southern strategy. What they are very good at is disguising it. And Democrats need to learn how to play a little bit of the same game. I think that we should not give up on white voters. I think that actually in this election, the fact that white voters didn't really shift that much at all, we actually gained among college-educated white voters, is very promising. I think that we should emphasize in particular how right-wingers are actually the ones who are hyper-obsessed with identity politics. They are hyper-obsessed with this anti-woman politics. I think that's what we should do. I think that we play defense way too much, and Democrats do not ever play offense. I think we should make a play for white voters. I think we should make a play for rural voters. I think we should point out that it's Democrats bringing them broadband access and all these things, whereas it is Republicans that are resulting in red states being some of the lowest quality of life states in the country. I would point out that our most porous, highest suicide rate states, highest male loneliness states, all these places are Republican places, the places with the lowest GDP, the places with the lowest economic development. I should point out that that if we're going to make a play for, in particular, Hispanic voters, I think that we should just really go on the offensive about how Republicans govern their states. I also think it's important that Democrats get their act together. I think that Democrats need to build a lot more housing in blue states. If they want to be competitive with red states economically, population growth-wise, and quality of life-wise, we need to build a lot more housing. It comes from the top down because a lot of local left-wing and liberal politicians don't want to expand their population. I think that's a big problem. But I do think that I'm not necessarily against the DEI stuff. I'm not against it. But I just don't think that it has much use to the electorate as a whole. I think that people value, in particular, good messaging on economic issues. People like Trump because they want to be rich. Like, that's the appeal of Trump. That's why they like him. They like a rich guy who tells them they can be rich too. And Democrats need to emphasize that, hey, here are the policies that we're going to do to increase our standard of living. Here are the policies that are going to result in us having some of the highest incomes in the world. These are what we should do. And most importantly, this is key, Democrats need to learn how to attack. Democrats do not know how to attack. All they know how to do is play defense. The fact that we are even spending our time talking about 11 trans women athletes in the NCAA is a result of the fact that we do not know how to attack. We only play defense. So I want Republicans to defend the fact that their states have higher murder rates than blue states. I want Republicans to defend the fact that their states have higher overdose rates than blue states. I want Republicans to defend the fact that 70% of our gross domestic product comes from Democratic and metropolitan areas and only 30% from theirs. I want Republicans to defend the mass amounts of subsidies that their states get while Democratic states pay more in taxes. I want Republicans to defend the fact that while they're talking about so-called trans kids in schools or whatever, that way more kids die from school shootings a year than there are even these transgender kids with surgeries in school. This is what I want us to do. I want us to be way more on the offensive. We need to tie Trump to tariffs. We need to tie Trump to higher cost of living. When Trump imposes another round of lumber tariffs and home costs go through the roof because developers stop building, that's Trump's rent increase. That's Trump's property tax increase. Trump was really good at tying all these issues like crime or whatever, high taxes, to Democrats, even when it wasn't valid. Democrats have to learn how to do the same thing.
Darrell Owens, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.